What's up, ladies and gentlemen? This is Joseph from NizhoniPhoto.com. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about a subject that's very near and dear to my photographic heart, and that is the subject of long exposure photography and how you can achieve it very easily in the field. So, as we know, long exposure photography is super cool. It's a technique where you just use long shutter speeds to kind of achieve these very ethereal and different looking images. The photo that we have right here on the screen, I took this just recently in Iceland. This is a long exposure, and as you can see here, this we were able to achieve this classic. Kind of like silky water from this waterfall here in Iceland. But what I'm really going to be talking about today is using super long exposure photos to really achieve some really awesome looking photos. So this is another picture that I took in Iceland. I had a really beautiful sunset, and I was just looking to capture something a little different, a little bit out of the box. So I took this beautiful sunset photo using a very long shutter speed. We're talking about an 8-minute long shutter speed here. And I was able to achieve this very ethereal and surreal looking image here where I just streaked these clouds across the sky. And it really doesn't even look that much like a photo now. It looks more like a painting. And I think that's pretty cool. And this was achieved by using a long shutter speed. This next photo is really my personal favorite. Again, I took this in Iceland. This was the same location as that first photo I showed you. This is Kirkjufelfoss, just in the Snæfellsnes Peninsula in Iceland. And here, I think this looks even better, what I was able to catch here. I was able to streak these clouds across the sky. But in this photo, I used a 2-minute long shutter speed because unlike the last photo where the shutter speed was a little too long, and I blurred the clouds into an oblivion to where they just kind of looked like blobs of light. I went with a long shutter speed, but not as long as the last one, to where I was able to streak these clouds, but still keep a lot of definition to where you can still see that they're actually clouds. So I used the long shutter speed for this, but here's the thing. Let's go back to this photo. You can see, let me go back to my grid. You can see my settings here. I have over 400-second shutter speed. Now that's about 7 minutes long as a shutter speed. But here's the deal. With this shutter speed, how did I know what settings I needed to use for this photo? I have an f11 and I have an ISO of 80. But how could you possibly know the exact settings that you're going to need to use in the field? Because when you're working with a long shutter speed, in this case 7 minutes, you really aren't going to have many tries to try and fail and adjust your exposure. We know that when we're out shooting landscapes, beautiful light comes and goes very quickly. So you really need to get the shot right in the moment. So you really can't take a 7-minute long shutter speed and mess it up and expect to have another 7 minutes to try it again. So if you're a little underexposed, you can't just add a stop of light to your next shot and expect you're going to get it. That good light could be gone. What you need to do is you need to know how to get that shot right the first time in camera so that when you take the shot, you can be confident that it's going to come out exposed. And then that way it just frees you up to really play around with the creative aspects of photography. Okay, so in order to do that, you do need to learn a few technical skills, and that's what I'm going to teach you today. The skill I'm going to teach you today is known as equivalent exposure. Now, what equivalent exposure is essentially it means that if you take a photo with one set of camera settings, meaning you have your shutter speed, your ISO, and your f-stop set, and the photo is properly exposed. Equivalent exposure means that you can get the same exposure with different camera settings as long as you have that you've removed and added an equivalent amount of stops of light. So what I mean is if you take one photo and you add a stop of light in the ISO, you're going to get the exact same exposure as long as you decrease a stop of light in another area. So if you add a stop of light in your ISO, as long as you decrease the stop of light from your f-stop, you're going to get the exact same exposure or an equivalent exposure. So what I've done here to kind of play around with this method to get you guys to understand it a little more is I've opened up this online manual camera simulator. I have my settings set here. We're at an ISO 100, an f-stop of f8, and a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. And if we take this sample photo, we can see that more or less this photo is properly exposed. What would happen if we were to add a stop of light to the ISO? Well, obviously it's going to be a little bit too bright because it's one stop of light overexposed. Okay? If we wanted to achieve an equivalent exposure of what we had before, all we need to do is remove a stop of light from any of our other two areas in our exposure triangle. So in this case, let's decrease a stop of light from the shutter speed. To do that, we'll go from a 1/50th of a second to 1/100th of a second, because we know that doing that is decreasing a stop of light. Now, if we take that photo, that is the equivalent exposure to what we had before. Now, before we go any further with this, I do need to let you know that in order to really make this work, you need to understand what a stop of light is and how that comes into play when you're talking about aperture and shutter speed. Okay, if you don't understand that concept, then this is going to be a little bit too advanced for you. So you need to really understand what it means to take a stop of light from your aperture or add a stop of light from the aperture, and the same thing with your shutter speed. Okay, so moving on. Let's say we wanted to add 2 stops of light to our image. So we could add 2 stops of light in our ISO. We could go from an ISO of 200 to an ISO of 800. So that's 2 stops of light more. Again, we'll take that photo way overexposed. Well, to get an equivalent exposure, all we need to do is decrease the stop of light from 2 other areas. We could take a stop of light from our aperture, so we could go from an f8 to an f11. And we could also take a stop of light from our shutter speed, so we could go from an f100 to an f200, take the photo, and that is the same exposure. It's an equivalent exposure. So that's what it is. Equivalent exposure just means you take a stop of light, you add a stop of light. Now, where this comes into play with long exposure photography is you're going to be working with removing maybe 10 stops of light for your image. So you would know if you take 10 stops of light from your photo, you're going to add 10 stops of light into your photo, okay? Now, working with these numbers can get a little bit confusing. I know it is for me because my brain just doesn't really work well with numbers. So a really easy way to understand this, or to just put this into practice when you're in the field, is to just use the camera rotator on your camera. So I have here a picture of a very beautiful Nikon D810. And as we know, this is our rotator dial. If we rotate this, it will adjust our camera settings. Now, I have mine set to 1/3 of a stop adjustment. So each time I click that dial, one way or the other, it's going to adjust it by 1/3 of a stop. So 3 stops would be the equivalent of a full stop adjustment. So if I have my camera set to ISO, if I were to click that dial 3 times, that's a full stop of light. If I were to click it the other way 3 times in ISO, I would be decreasing a stop of light. So here's what I'm getting at. Rather than really having to understand all of these numbers and remember them in your head, an even easier way is to decrease the stop of light or increase the stop of light with your rotator dial on your camera. Click it 3 times and then make a mental note that that's a stop of light. And now all you need to do is go to another area of adjustment in your camera and decrease it by stop of light, or 3 clicks. So if you're working with 10 stops of light with ISO and aperture, that can get kind of confusing, especially if you're maybe taking 7 stops of light from your ISO or your aperture and 8 and 3 stops of light from your shutter speed. That can get kind of hard to remember. So just remember it this way. I need to remove 10 stops of light. Go 3 clicks on your rotator wheel, and that's a stop of light. So every 3 clicks is an extra stop of light. So just do it 3 times and then count 1. Another 3 times, 2. So if you're working with a lot of stops of light, that's a really easy way to do it. That's how I actually do it in the field, because then I don't even need to think about the numbers. All I do is I click that dial and I remember how many times I'm clicking it, and it's that simple. Now, how do we piece all this together? We're going to go back to our image here. Remember, we're in the field. We've got these beautiful clouds. We need to capture this image, but we might only have minutes or even seconds to do this. How are we going to find the exact exposure when we're working with a super long shutter speed, like a 4-minute or an 8-minute? Well, I'm going to break it down into 3 simple steps. Step 1. You're going to find your proper exposure on your manual mode in your camera. So put your camera to manual mode and take the picture until the exposure is where you want it to be. Now that could mean that it's properly exposed. For me personally, when I'm shooting sunsets, I like to underexpose my images a little bit because you get a lot more detail in the colors. All you need to do is go into manual mode, find your exposure, and that's step 1. Find your exposure in manual mode. Step 2 is to adjust the shutter speed that you're at for your proper exposure and adjust that to 30-second shutter speed using equivalent exposure. Okay, so let's go back to that website and just to kind of put this into perspective. Let's say you found your proper exposure and you were at an f/10 of a second, right? Look at me down here in the shutter icon here. Let's say you were at 1/10 of a second. If you were to go from 1/10 of a second to 1/30th of a second, I'll show you how we can do that right here. Now, this simulator will only let me go to about 1 second, so we'll have to improvise. From 1/10 of a second, we could just go click, click, click. That's one stop of light. Click, 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 2 stops of light. Click, 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 3 stops of light. Actually, I didn't click it right. 3 stops of light would take us from 1/10 of a second shutter speed to 1 second. Now from there, we could just do the math in our head. Okay, from 1 second, an extra stop of light would be 2 seconds. An extra stop of light from there would be from 2 seconds to 4 seconds to 8 seconds to 16 seconds. And then more or less 5 stops of light from 1 second would bring us to 30 seconds, more or less. Now, if we were to add in the 3 stops of light that we took to get to that 1 second, I'm really bad at math. That is 8 stops of light. So if we were in the field and we had our proper exposure and we were at a 1/10 of a second, we could just adjust the dial on our camera until we get to 30 seconds and then figure out how many stops of light that is, and then decrease the stops of light from our ISO or our aperture. And that's all you really have to do. One thing I would like to mention is from what we were working at, 8 stops of light would actually be closer to about maybe 34 seconds or even 35. But when you're working with these longer shutter speeds, you don't have to be exactly exact in the numbers. You just have to be close. So we're in step 2. We're adjusting our settings to get to our shutter speed to 30 seconds. Now, while you're still new at this topic, I think it'd be a good idea to take a test shot at 30 seconds and see how it is. Now, again, when you're in the field, time is going to be of the essence. So, you might not have a lot of time to really capture the shot. But if you do, go ahead and when you're in step 2, take a 30-second long test shot just to make sure that your shutter speed is where you want it to be. Okay, Step 3. While you're at 30 seconds, step 3 is simple. All you do is you use equivalent exposure to adjust your shutter speed from 30 seconds to wherever you want it to be. Now, from 30 seconds, if we were to increase our shutter speed by stops of light, from 30 seconds, if we were to add a stop of light, what would it be from 30 seconds? It would be 60 seconds or a minute. If we were to add another stop of light from a minute, it would be 2 minutes. Now, if we go back to this shot, we would be done because this was about a 2-minute long shutter speed, okay? My Lightroom here says 60 seconds. I'm not sure why, but I remember I used 2 minutes in the field. So we would be done here. So if we were at a shutter speed of 30 seconds and let's say an f-stop of f8 and an ISO of 200, if we were to go from 30 seconds and we were to add 2 stops of light with our shutter speed, right, to go from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, we would just need to decrease 2 stops of light from any other area. If we were at a 200 ISO, we could take a stop of light from our ISO, bring it down from 200 to 100. And now from that point, we only have one more stop of light. So we could bring it from our f-stop. We could go from an f8 to an f11. And now if I were to take that shot at 2 minutes long, at the end of that 2-minute long shot, my shot is going to be perfectly exposed to how it was when I started at step 1. And that's how I was able to achieve this shot. It only took me maybe about 60 seconds to set this shot up, and then the 2 minutes to actually take the shot, and I was done. Now, couple things to keep in mind. When you're in step 3, you're going to either need to set your camera into bulb mode or into, I can't remember what the name of the mode is, but there's bulb mode where what that does is you plug in your remote to your camera, and when you hold down the shutter button, it opens the shutter up, and when you press it again or let go, it's going to stop the shot, okay? Another mode, which is actually, if it's one click to the left from bulb mode on my camera, and it shows it as 2 little dashes on my D810 information window. That's the method I prefer to use because what it does in that setting is if I push the camera button, the shutter button down on my camera, it starts the shot. And if I hit it again, it stops the shot. So that's what I prefer to do because I really don't like using remotes in the field. I just go ahead and I push my shutter button. I let the shot start. And if I'm only working with a 2-minute long shot, I just count it out in my head. I just count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, all the way to 2 minutes. And then at the end of the 2 minutes, I very gingerly stop the shot by pressing down my shutter button. And that's all you have to it. You just need to keep in mind that, again, in step 3, when you have your shutter speed at 30 seconds, you just keep in mind that from there, an extra stop of light from 30 seconds would be 1 minute. 2 stops of light would be 2 minutes. And then from there, from stops of light, it goes from 4 minutes to 8 minutes to 16 minutes to 32 minutes. And then 7 stops of light from 30 seconds is an hour and 4 minutes. So what that means is by using this technique, you could take a photo in pitch dark. You could take it for an hour and 4 minutes. And when you're done with that shot, it is going to look exactly the way it was when you started taking the picture. And that is using equivalent exposure to achieve the results that you want in your photo with just a little bit of setup. So I hope this video was very helpful to you. If you have any questions, please stay in touch, send me an email, or just leave me a question in the comments, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and happy shooting. Peace.